Well, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah,
We've
it's
devoted an immense amount of time to the consultation, and I want you to get some value out of it, I hope.
yeah,
Um,
and I think it's really important, even though our game was not really successful.
we will talk
To
more about it, I
yeah,
think.
yeah,
The first thing is to revisit the goals of the
yeah,
consulting in the first
indeed.
place.
I was thinking exactly the same, that we must, like, before getting delved deep into what we were doing when we played the game, we should, like, first see that what we were after in the
Hmm.
first place. And considering this, uh, the beginning goal, if I remember correctly, was to uh, uh, like check and investigate how one could increase visibility for a game like this, like a story game that feels like it's a very small margin of role players are playing games like this. And especially in Finland, it seems that, uh, well, there are those of us who play these games a lot, and we already like know each other
And
almost.
well, you have already bought each other's games, and now what do you do?
Yeah, yeah,
Right, I
yeah,
know the feeling.
indeed. Yeah,
So, okay. Well, there are the purpose of playing was to arrive at an honest view of what is best to promote.
yeah, yeah,
And
indeed.
one of the uh, and then we can also talk about the best venue to promote. And
Yeah,
the obvious solution is to try to get into the most popular live play and recorded play venues
yeah,
like
yeah.
the Gauntlet and things like that.
Okay, yeah,
Now, so that seems to be the way to go these days.
yeah,
It seems that that visibility as active play is the most important thing,
yeah,
and you can either record play. This might be my best suggestion, and it might
yeah,
seem obvious, but it is an investment in both time and skill,
yeah.
which is to get. I'm looking around for my example.
Yeah,
One of
it,
these with its little
yeah,
tripod, and they are surprised. They are expensive, but they are not as expensive as one might
yeah,
think. You do have to buy something. You will feel it, but it's not like you have bought a car or
yeah,
it's not like buying a laptop. It's a lot
yeah,
cheaper than that. So, and then of course there's the fun of learning all the editing and the uploading and that entire world that I have
yeah,
now
yeah,
joined. I don't know if
indeed.
you've seen any other videos that I have produced, but I think they are getting. You can see the production ever
Yeah,
so slightly, ever so
actually,
slightly, ever so
yeah,
slightly. Right.
I haven't.
Mm-hmm.
I really, like, I can notice
Mm-hmm.
the difference is quite big from the ones you did in the beginning.
That was my hope
Yeah,
when I first put
yeah,
those up. I said I might as well start, and then a year from now, everybody will be saying, "Oh, do you remember what it was like back then?"
yeah.
So,
And
because the only
definitely,
way to learn is just to keep doing it.
yeah,
Well, anyway, so therefore, when you go to the conventions and when you have, I mean, you have had many experiences
yeah,
at the table.
yes,
And many of them have been short form, very strict short form. We are here
yes,
and we better do it because this is all we have.
yeah. And last weekend I did that for
Right.
6 sessions of it.
Well, and this circumstance, I don't want to make you feel bad because this I feel bad about it regarding games that I played last year, which I did not record.
Yeah,
And so I look back on those games and I'm furious because I could have recorded them so nicely.
yeah, Yeah.
And now all I can say is next time you do that, have your tripod.
Yeah.
And depending on your capabilities, I also have my webcam and the laptop. Setting up both
Yeah.
gives you two angles, and
Yes. Two
and
angles.
it's very easy to record.
Can edit.
The
Yeah.
camera uses a card. You can plug it into the computer, but
Yeah.
frankly, that's a lot of connections and shit that can go
Yeah.
wrong. So it's better to just put the card into the camera and put the
Yeah.
card into the computer later.
Yeah. Memory card.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Indeed.
with that, you will have promotional ammunition.
Yeah.
And for purposes of promotion, and this is something I need to start thinking about, I need to be able to clip out 5 or 10 minutes of a game and use it for promotion. So somebody says, I mean, where I have people buying Sorcerer right now, I need to put up a YouTube clip
Yeah.
that is 10 minutes of playing Sorcerer that you can really see system stuff happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
And have I done it? No, because I am lame. You are not lame, and you should do it. So, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the that would be very, very powerful for you, because especially if, and again, this actually might be something I would be willing to help with, to have a little clip of that play and actually have a page come up that shows the grains,
Yeah.
get added. You
Yeah.
actually see the grain get added as the person is saying,
Yeah.
and then I
Yeah.
make him. I'm adding two to hallucinations. In the
Yeah.
grains, there's
Yeah.
hallucinations in our story,
Yeah.
and
And some visual cues to
right,
like enhance uh, the viewer, so he can like immediately
right.
see the
By a year
actual
from
system in
now,
the play. Yeah.
I hope that my videos are going to have really nice system graphics.
Yeah. Yeah.
That people can actually see. If you roll 5, then what happens? So then this number changes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Indeed.
I theoretically I could do it right now, but it would take me 12 hours.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but anyway, I'm getting better and better at that, and I would be happy to help you. It's
Yeah.
because with Tales of Entropy in particular, you're selling system.
Yeah.
So
That's
that
true.
means you
That's
have to
true.
promote system, and they have to see it.
Yeah.
And so those coming, it sounds very labor intensive, especially at first, but even a few of those in different genres
Yeah.
will really showcase the game very nicely for you.
Yeah.
And those are
That's
good because they are easily shared on social media.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's
you could use them as promotion at conventions and things like that. People would say,
yeah.
should I sign up for that game? Oh, I'll follow this link. Oh, I watched 10 minutes. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want to do that. So
Yeah.
I think that would be a big help.
Yeah.
Then we have to think about, what do we do as you expand the game into different players. And you've played a lot of games. When you played those 6 sessions, was
Yeah.
it with a different group of people each time?
Yes.
That's
It was.
fantastic.
Yeah. It's the normal. I did it last year also. I have this setup where I use only marginal.
Right.
I use only some of the rules of the game, and I have
Yes, you have materials to
characters.
start with. I know
I
that.
have
Yeah.
materials.
Yeah.
And now I had two. Actually, I have had 3 different scenarios now ready, but
Right.
2 of them only got played,
Oh, really?
and they were
So did 3 of each, or 2 and 4, or something like that?
3 and 3.
Okay. It's like a bit of a lab experiment. I have done something similar with
Yeah.
with demos at conventions, and it is pretty strange what different groups can do with exactly the
That-
same starting
that-
materials. Yeah.
That is really like, the difference is huge, and you can't like predict any of that, because
Right.
sometimes you have experienced players and you kind of have to drag them through everything.
We talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah. and and other times it just happens. Once we had one of my scenarios was surround Duckburg,
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
uh, around that. So I got 4 players. 4 young women came. I think they did not
Right.
know too much about role playing. They were there. It's all that it was also an anime con.
Right. Right.
They came. Oh, they knew about Duckburg because it's in Finland. It is almost like a general knowledge,
Yes.
and
I've learned that in the Nordic countries.
yeah,
So yes.
it's really 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 popular from
Hmm.
the 50s
Yes.
onwards.
Yes.
Uh, And so they kind of just grabbed my material and started with it, and I was like, okay, let's. I just after
Let
the
me
first,
ask. I was going
yeah,
to ask this. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's
yeah,
a powerful thing to think about for just a minute. So you did the Duckburg material 3 times last weekend.
yeah, yeah.
You had the 4 young women in one group. You had a second group and a third group. So briefly, what happened in each one?
Uh,
Them in a contrasting way.
in a contrasting way, this one that I was explaining was that they had really like no experience over uh, this kind of play or anything, but they just kind of intuitively grasped it quite
Hmm.
well, and like the game rolled for the hour that it was supposed to do, and it had 4 scenes in it, and went really well. And the second one was, I would say it went quite well also. It had 3 guys who were playing together normally. They were like a playing group.
Right. So they were a
Uh,
coherent group with their
yeah,
own set of language and
yeah, yeah.
cues and things. Yes.
I think they normally played Dungeons and Dragons. I think they said that they were playing normally that, and there, one of them was their game master, and then 2 players.
Hmm.
And of course, the game master was most active of these 3, but still, the 2 others were quite surprisingly active as well. So it went quite well as well.
Okay.
And the third one was such that it had 2 of the players were very like closed, so they didn't
Hmm.
uh,
The
easily.
contributions did not
Yeah,
jump into everyone else. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the players said that when he had to like start the scene, he said
Oh,
to me that
okay.
I'm not a storyteller in any
Right.
way. So I said that there is in this situation there is no pressure, that you don't have to feel any pressure about this. And then we just suggested different ideas, different players suggested ideas, and he kind of chose what he wanted out of these ideas.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, I was a little bit interested as well in the differences in the fiction. You know that I like to focus on
yeah.
the grains a little bit. So I think that's, without being too specific, what was the fiction like in each one? When I say what happened, I'm
Uh,
talking about in what was produced.
yeah. I think the material, what we got was quite a bit similar with
Hmm.
all of these. This is mainly because the situation for a con game like this, I make it very closed, and
Hmm.
the characters are already there, and they have like clear motives what
Right.
they are
Right.
doing, and the beginning setup is very very clear. And I tend to open the game with my character in this with like a quite powerful move that
Yes.
sets
Yes.
the pieces in motion. I would say that the Dungeons and Dragons group used most of the grains that were available. They kind of like grasp things.
There was a
Uh,
resource and they went to go and find it. Yes.
yeah, because there was Beagle Boys were like a grain
Hmm.
in my setup, and they were the only group that took that grain and used it. So they invited Beagle Boys to attack the money.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but indeed that was the, I think, most it was thing that differentiated most
I see. Okay.
fiction wise.
Okay, well, genre familiarity also matters because obviously all the players knew what a story with these characters would be like.
Yeah.
And although conceivably they could have done something different, it's also clear that they knew what it would be.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some things to remember. But again, being able to record this and then to pick bits and pieces or perhaps a whole session for an extended viewing as your promotional device really seems like the only solution. Otherwise, you are stuck with generic phrases about this is a story game with no game master and all that stuff, and everybody will look and say, well, I play Fiasco, so what do I need with that?
Yeah.
Right. So okay. Aside from that, I'm not sure what else to tell you except that let's see, do you already have it on drive-through RPG?
Yeah.
You're right. So of course, anything there just gets swamped. Everything, it's just completely swamped unless you have some kind of engine driving toward it. And the only thing I can really think of is try to get a productive cycle between talking about your videos and your presentation, your promotion, and then turning that into sales, if possible. The cover is very, very beautiful. It is really a terrible, terrible thing to say for a game like this. And I know that people have tried to do hundreds of different things over and over to try to get around this. But the fact is, having some kind of representational image involved in your promotion is a really good idea.
Yeah. We talked about it earlier, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's
like something to the problem with being generic. We talked about it. It's related to this, that if there is something very precise and like what can be grasped, it's easier to get some feeling about it if you're like a customer or
true. And the fact is too is that it is simply more attractive as a purchase point, which is a somewhat less idealistic reason. So with that in mind, let us take a look at our game. And then we can see a few observations. We may agree or disagree about some things. One thing I want to say is that if I say something that sounds critical of the game, you don't have to defend it. You can either say in your head, bullshit, I'm wasting my money talking to you. Or you can say, well, I'll think about that later. Or you can say, okay, forget that part. I'll pay attention to some other part that he says. That's whatever. But I found that it's difficult, especially if the game is complete or almost complete, then it's very hard to talk about its design. It's so fixed that the author is not ready to go there.
Take in any information regarding.
He also had a very interesting experience that was the same as me, because he and I talked about this. He also felt as though the character was very protagonistic to him internally. And he kept wondering why nobody else liked Lieti. And that was my experience. I was like, Zoki's a great character. Why does everybody else keep talking about him like he's like he's the bad guy or something? And so, and I don't mind telling you, I hated Arcturus almost the entire time. As a character,
I talked about this with Paul, and it seems that I and Paul saw Arcturus differently than you and perhaps
Mm-hmm.
Santiago did also. But this is one thing we talked about. We talked with Paul about this, and I also talked with Eero about something like the story that emerges from a game like this. We compared like a game like your game, Slay with Me. It always forms a kind of one story. There is
Right.
one
Right.
protagonist, there is one antagonist, there is the lover,
Mm-hmm.
there are the other. Everything
It's
else is
extremely focused and predefined.
yeah,
That's true. Yes.
yeah, and that is it. It brings out one specific storyline mostly,
Right.
and then in the other end of the spectrum we have games like Shock. You know,
Right.
every player has a protagonist and an antagonist also.
Yes.
But the stories of these different characters, while they might cross with each other, they are still separate, and it
Yes.
is possible to play a game of Shock where your characters never meet each other.
Strangely enough, Sorcerer is very similar.
Yeah.
And it is very functional. Don't get me wrong. I am very happy with that, and I agree. There's another feature about that, which is that the different players' experiences of the characters can be very, very different, and their judgments can be different. And I am fine with that.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm saying happened here. I am only pointing out that each of us, okay, regardless, even if we are having that experience that you are describing,
Yeah.
each of us needs to be invested in the other people's characters as protagonists.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, even if I dislike the character, I might say, but I can get it. I can see the character.
Yeah.
I hate what is happening. I'm saying, oh, there he goes down the drain. No, there he's morally he's gone. Shadow for you, Shadow. But I am also saying, but I understand.
Yeah.
I didn't have that for Arcturus. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and you kind of have
Right.
to see the story of that character.
Sure.
So you must see some way that he's like where he's going, where
Sure.
he's coming
Or at
from,
least
and
understand the
what is-
pressures that drove him
Yeah.
this way.
Yeah.
And again, I'm talking about my experience. I'm not trying to talk about anyone else's, but I didn't have that for Arcturus.
Yeah.
And I also, in talking with Paul, was interested, and I think he wrote this as well. He always, as he put it, set up Arcturus to fail.
Yeah.
He conceived of him as just a character going down the drain.
Yeah.
And to me, that actually is a problematic attitude to have in a game like Tales of Entropy. Because, first of all, if you're not advocating for your character, nobody else is going to.
Yeah. Everybody's going to bring him down.
Well, because and there's a mechanic that unfortunately causes that. And so you have to, everybody is fighting against the burden mechanic at all times.
Yeah.
If you want your character to be, unless we just want to do misery pornography where the characters all turn into psychopathic cannibals and they all just, becomes this ridiculous mess.
But that is not like nobody wants that.
Right, exactly. And so it is not likely because most of the time, most people will be, even if they don't know they're doing it, they will be advocating for their character.
Yeah.
And so the problem, and Arcturus, I don't think, had any advocation for him. And so it's possible to look at it and feel sympathy. Perhaps Paul did, perhaps you did, but there's very little. If you really review the videos, there's really very little that Paul does to hand us anything that we never learn anything about his relationship with anybody else, nothing about his past, nothing about, nothing to go on. He never does anything nice or admirable. So you're just looking and going, well, so it's the behavior of the character is consistent with what Paul was telling me, that he did not have a sense of Arcturus as a positive presence.
Yeah.
This is a tricky thing. the narrator, I'm thinking about the time when my character had been fictionally established at the end of his scene from the previous session, and then I wanted to do an action. Paul said, let's play a little bit. I want you to talk to the patriarch first and, give him some blood or whatever and do all that.
Yeah.
And then I'll say that you end up in this situation. He frames me into a completely different situation. Neither the one I was in nor the one that my action was directed toward in terms of locations.
Yeah.
So the interesting point is there's a lot of power to subvert a character's actions.
Yeah.
And it became very, very difficult to... I kind of went with it in play and said, well, okay, I'll go there instead. But...
Yeah.
I went with it in play, but I found it very difficult to play when the narrator happily decided what the venue was for my character, where I would be, what I would do. I guess you could call it a hard move in Apocalypse World, but even hard moves are supposed to use what is happening.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that there is a weird disconnect between the fictionally established phenomena and what he wanted my character to get thrown into. And that's a good question for Tales of Entropy. Just what does the narrator get to do? Can he just... can the character suddenly find himself in Antarctica?
Yeah.
And so, and that's just because, I say, by the way, you flew to Antarctica, or you wake up in Antarctica, and you're kind of going, well, wait a minute. So, so it's kind of a good question. I don't know how adjustable that is. In Fiasco, your responsibility is to play the character unsympathetically.
Yeah.
But I said that has kind of started to bleed out to all these other games where people sit down and say, okay, and they just launch in with their character being completely objectionable. And they themselves have no other priority except to watch the character come to grief. Yeah. And so...
I think in Tales of Entropy it is possible to play such a character if he takes the role of the antagonist of the story.
I agree, but even then, the antagonist of the story has to have those qualities we talked about, where you can see where they are coming from.
Yeah, you must see.
Other than that,
like from where he's coming and where he's going.
From the tropes people, even though that site has its limitations, but the tropes people call it the idiot ball. Or the villain ball.
Okay.
All of a sudden the character is given the ball and it says, you're an idiot, and they have to do a stupid thing to make the plot go, or to just have anything happen. And the other one is the villain ball. The person just decides to shoot a minion or to rob a bank or to just do a bad thing because... And so to play an antagonist who does not hold the idiot ball or the villain ball is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That to me is one of the greatest moments of Sorcerer, when you don't have to have a designated bad guy for an NPC, and everything is great that way. But that's very different from playing a Fiasco type character, where the character is objectionable because there is no reason. They are just an asshole. They are just an idiot.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, it's difficult to... it's a bad habit, basically. It's just a bad habit to bring into play.
One of the things about the antagonism of the characters in Tales of Entropy is something that I kind of discovered only recently when I, after this game, when I talked about it with Paul and reviewed this with myself, is that the role of player who is delivering burden has like tremendous power over what
Right.
happens to that character. If you see some character to be protagonistic, you can you have the power to bring him down or to elevate him, because
Yes.
I used an example of I discussed with Paul about this. Paul gave me Paul gave to Stylia a burden of the monster is revealed when we met, and when Stylia enchanted Arcturus with magic,
Right.
and that was like the turning point of Stylia in the Stylia story.
Right.
I
Right.
would say that before that he was like this messiah character,
Right.
more or less. He was like the golden-haired man who
Wondrous
came-
stories and
Yeah,
stuff, magic coins.
and after that
Right. Right.
he gave me this like dark strain to it, and I
Right.
like playing dark strains. It isn't it. I'm not saying that I disliked it, but you can imagine what would have happened if he gave me that Stylia would have fallen in love with Arcturus, for
Sure.
example.
Sure.
Like,
It's love for right. That this
Yeah.
is I was actually I'm glad you brought this up because the last thing on my list to talk about was the burden mechanic.
Yeah.
And I was going to contrast it with the grains mechanic. I wrote a whole column on the grains mechanic
Yeah,
at the site,
yeah.
right? So I
Yeah.
think I even did a little video about it. And so, therefore, the grains to me are very, very important.
Yeah.
But I looked at the burdens and I looked pretty carefully at which burdens were granted to which character through all those hours of play. And there were a couple of very interesting phenomena. Just as you say, you can give a burden to somebody that opens up the character.
Yeah.
And the easiest one is to give them a positive burden, which means you can't blame the character for it, but you can see how it will make things go badly.
Yeah.
Right? That's the easiest and the nicest burden. Grieves for his wife
Yeah.
can be a burden, but
Yeah.
you feel bad for the guy because he grieves for his wife, even if
Yeah.
it lowers his effectiveness.
Yeah.
So then you have other things which are fairly straightforward and understandable that come straight from the fiction. Now you are scarred.
Yeah.
Because of the wound. Now you are scarred. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you have things that are very unforgivable, or at least like that villain ball or the idiot ball.
Yeah.
So as soon as Zoki got diluted,
Yeah.
I'm doomed.
Yeah.
No matter what conflict I'm in, somebody can bring in diluted. It's generic,
Yeah.
first of
Yeah.
all. It's generic, and second, it's completely negative.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, almost no matter what I would do, from now on, the burden reader can simply slap
Yeah.
diluted on me. Now, the reason that could still be functional is if everybody bought into Zoki as a protagonist. If they did that without thinking about it, they would assign diluted sometimes and not other times.
Yeah.
So that in the long run, the delusion would be nuanced.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that only happens, and it cannot happen deliberately, it would only happen organically because the people doing it liked Zoki.
Yeah.
And so that can happen, but the chance for the burdens to send everybody down the pit. So, for example, the monster revealed, it's very tricky. The impact on the player can be very strong. Nothing is saying you had to continue to play him as a monster. And technically, if you didn't play him as a monster, then the burden reader should not assign the monster revealed because your actions didn't warrant it, technically. And so, therefore, it is... but you see that can be a little aggressive. The burden reader says, no, the monster revealed. And now the narrator of the outcome is going to look at the monster revealed and will include that in the narration. And there's nothing you can do about it.
Of course. And
So
sometimes it's also that you have to yourself narrate that
yes, yes,
because you won the conflict, you
right,
got the burden because the
right.
one who wins the conflict is and the beautiful thing I think is when you can really integrate something given in the burdens and the
I
grains
completely agree
rather
that
than
narration is actually the easiest part of the game because of the different angles of material.
yeah
You have the burden material, you have the outcome, you have the goal, you have all kinds of interesting things, the changes in the grains. You have
yeah
lots of material to work with for a nice narration. And we never had a problem with that. None of us.
yeah and
So,
even though perhaps because of this even with all our difficulties, like uh, in in addition to the difficulties we already mentioned, we have that we intervened so sparsely, so that we had like 2 months between
right, of
sessions,
course. No, that certainly
and
didn't help. Yeah.
yeah, that also like added, and still the fiction part of what we got was really kind of good.
I completely agree. I mean, if you look, it came off as kind of one of those really nice Tanith Lee stories,
Yeah,
in my opinion. And I think it's almost a matter of some shock,
yeah,
that it did that. But with
yeah,
that, with let's look at the burden as a potential tipping point
yeah,
for the enjoyment of play in the way that I'm talking about.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
the one
I
place in the
agree.
game where the dynamics of the mechanics of the game can shift into a completely different purpose or a completely
Yeah,
different role
yeah,
in where things go. And so it might be kind of interesting to work with training in burdens. Now that's a good question. What sort of burdens appeared in the Duckburg stories?
yeah. Uh, well, because the games were so short,
Right,
we mostly ended increasing the burdens that were already given,
right,
or giving something that was very. You said the one category of these is what
right.
comes
Very
straight out
consequential.
of
Right,
narration. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, it was almost entirely of that because there is so short a time to get attached to the characters,
Right.
so that you
And I
can
imagine with a
yeah
Duckburg setting and
yeah
the strong framing of your situation,
yeah
that action and occurrence were
yeah
pretty
yeah
quick
they
and
were like
right,
driving force of the thing was
right,
that action led
right,
to reaction
right.
and stuff. And it has well the time frame was so that there was no room for like slow scenes or something
Sure.
like that. It was
Well, it's a
just
very,
1 hour of mayhem.
interesting question. The We're not really trying to problem solve here,
Yeah,
right? In this conversation, that's not really the issue. You know the circumstances in which the game works best, and you know how to present it properly so that that happens. You know a lot. You know.
but still,
Um,
it may be that there should be some more information how to assign burdens
uh,
because of
right,
this.
right. I suggest that a best practices for burdens
Yeah, yeah,
or a best,
indeed.
or maybe for all certain, what is best practices of narration? What is best practices for burdens?
Yeah,
What is, and
yeah,
for most of those, it's going to be pretty easy because you don't
yeah,
see problems with narration. But still, it's
yeah,
nice to have the best practices so that everybody kind of feels good,
yeah,
when they read it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
for burdens, I think that would be the place, and I actually think that it's if you had to pick one thing, that would be the mechanic, right
yeah,
there.
yeah,
For just that reason. I was wondering what would happen if one were to wiggle that mechanic and hack the game slightly
yeah,
for fun. To see what would happen if uh, you had one burden and people just made it go up or down.
yeah,
And that would be, I don't know if that would work or not, but it's kind of an interesting idea that would at least keep the content of the burden consistent,
Yeah.
and you wouldn't have suddenly this other content thrown in.
Yeah.
One of the most tricky things is a burden, or for that matter, a trait, which is universally applicable. I complained about one of Santiago's traits, that he's always prepared,
Yeah.
or and it's kind of like, well, when isn't that going to happen?
Yeah.
By
Yeah.
definition, if he's in a situation, then
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's always
so
going to apply.
that's there's no way to control for that. Although you could point it out as a best practice issue,
Yeah.
something that can happen.
Yeah.
Um,
And
so
kind of the burden mechanic in the beginning, when I started to make this game, the burden mechanic was one of the first ideas
mhm.
of this game, because the goal was to fix a problem with all powerful traits.
Right.
Because if you have a character who has like all of his traits are always applicable, he
I am
always
magnificent.
yeah.
When
And
well, what are you going to do where when you're not
Yeah.
magnificent, right?
I
Yeah.
throw 10 dice and I will always win.
Right.
In
Right.
Tales of Entropy, if you always win like with margin of 6 or 7, you will be screwed.
Right.
Because
Right.
the burdens will get you down. That was the first inspirations.
Right. Well, there's a lot going on there that is sound numerically.
Yeah.
And so then the next question is, let us take the concept of what this means fictionally, and now let's take it to the most difficult issue, which is now we are having a bunch of humans
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah.
What is the biggest problem with cars? The mechanism sitting behind the steering wheel is the biggest problem, right? So we don't, of course, want to look at it this way. We want to say that people are wonderful. People are storytellers. People are they want to be entertained. They want to listen to each other. We can do this, and so just like most people want to drive safely and get where they are going.
Yeah.
So I agree. We can take that positive view of people, and then we say, all right, let's make sure that they're. Let's not make sure. Let's at least think about, again, what is it about this one dangerous part of the mechanism?
Yeah.
And I like the facts. I've said many times, and don't misunderstand me. Many times I've said, a game that produces stories, that is guaranteed to produce stories, and guaranteed to work, doesn't succeed.
Yeah.
If you give me a musical instrument that's guaranteed to play a beautiful song every time I pick it up, you did not give me an actual instrument to play. And so it's shocking to people when I say the best narrativist game is the one that makes it possible. It is possible for you not to be able to succeed.
Yeah.
And they're shocked. They're saying, what are you talking about? How is that system? And it's like, well, I'm talking about systems like musical instruments, not systems like making sausages. Yeah. So in that case, I mean, the fact that, and there's an expression in English you probably know quite well, which is, they say, to give enough rope.
Yeah.
And so it's up to you whether you hang yourself.
Yeah, indeed.
And so Tales of Entropy, like Sorcerer, has that quality.
Yeah.
You can, if you don't commit to certain principles of storytelling only because you want to.
Yeah.
If you don't, then the game will just hang you, right?
Yeah.
And so as an experience. And so this is something to think about in terms of teaching people what to do.
Yeah.
I hope that's a helpful thought.
Yeah. I gave Soki a burden of he was feeling responsible for the boy.
Right.
And I thought about that afterwards, that immediately after I did that, I kind of felt that Zoki could be protagonistic.
Right. And at that point, I adopted that and started behaving very much to make him into a dragon and things like that.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that giving
Right.
burdens, giving constructive burdens,
Right.
like
You need to be able to give
restrictions,
someone a
but
burden to
yeah,
work with. Right.
yeah,
Right.
indeed. That I'm not sure yet if there are any rules or regulations, but
I don't think
perhaps
there
like
can
best
be.
practices.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's really the only. That's really the useful concept.
yeah,
Is best
yeah,
practices. I
yeah,
completely agree with you, and in that case, I think that it's a constructive consult because not only are we talking about practical elements of promotion, we're also talking about content.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
what things you can
indeed.
say, things you can
Yeah,
teach, things you can emphasize to
and
people.
things you can learn about your own game.
Oh sure, oh
Yeah,
sure, yeah,
I feel
yeah. No,
like what's
absolutely.
better than to learn things about your own game?
I
It's like
undergo that process quite a bit, to the extent sometimes that I look at it and say, "Who wrote this?"
yeah,
You know, that happens.
yeah. One thing I must mention, we talked about earlier about presenting things of the game, like presenting a light version or like
Yeah.
presenting some material that is focused on some genre or thing.
Well, that's
But
more or less what you do already, right? For your
yeah,
games. Yeah.
yeah. But one thing that I thought
Oh.
about
Uh huh.
is to write uh, uh, write like a digital PDF version of the rules I used in conventions, because it's a small subset of
Right.
the
Right.
actual entropy rules, and pair it with some
Yes. I
scenario
would be happy to write
titling.
one. That would be fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That sounds like
Because
fun.
that would be like uh, it has the scenario set, and additionally it must have pre-made characters that
Right.
are in conventions. So that
That would be fine. The pre-made characters are made all the way. They're complete. Is that right?
uh, yeah, well, it depends what you're after.
Right.
If one would be after the thing that I have done, so that you can play short mini games of 1 hour,
Right.
then you have to write really complete characters, hand it over, and get everyone to the same page, and then play 4 scenes with them.
You know what's quite interesting is to have, now this is almost a little too programmed, is to have a bunch of characters. The beginning of the opening situation is to have uh, a dead character in the opening
Yeah,
situation. Someone is killed,
yeah,
and you have not, and the murderer will be assigned. It can be assigned as a burden during play
yeah, yeah,
once.
yeah, yeah.
And
Like
so, and the fun thing
murderer.
is that everybody should kind of understand that it's better to wait a little while.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
wait a little while, and sooner or later,
yeah,
someone's going to say, "Okay, you're the murderer." So
yeah,
it's almost too much of a trick. It's a
yeah,
gimmick, but it's sort of but it occurs to me as sort of fun if you one wanted to
yeah.
demonstrate that.
That would be
But
like one way to
right,
do it.
I'm not sure. I mean, I think I would do it a little bit more traditionally, just more like the
Yeah,
Duckburg thing. But still,
yeah,
it's an amusing idea.
yeah,
Um, anyway, so yes, I would be perfectly happy to work on something like that.
yeah.
Um,
That would be
yeah,
like the scenario should picking scenario for something like this, if one would to publish it freely on the internet or something like that, would be an interesting challenge. What scenario would really work with that? Because you can't really use like anything licensed material like Duckburg or something like that,
right. Well,
because
I think it's pretty easy in some ways.
yeah,
Even if you just the easiest way is to take something that is very familiar,
yeah,
and instead of Doctor Strange, you call it Doctor Weird, or instead of Doctor
yeah,
Who, you call it Doctor When,
yeah, yeah,
you know,
yeah,
or
yeah,
something like that. And you
yeah,
could do that, but in my opinion, I would prefer to do something a little bit more like your example in the book. where it's a nice, rich setting with lots of atmospheric and cultural content.
Yeah.
And then you have characters who are clearly in conflict in some way, or at least are very visibly present. And then you will let the players' development of the characters in play really let us know who they really are.
Yeah.
So that becomes quite interesting.
Yeah.
So all right. Well, Petteri, that's unless you have something else.
About the Duckburg, I was
going
to say just that in about 2 months I signed in for a local. It's not even a convention; it's a day of games in Jyväskylä here in the city, and they already they have these retro video games and board games and stuff like that. But I assigned myself to play Duckburg there, so let's see what happens.
Sure. Let's see if you can get hold or borrow or use a camera.
Yeah,
that would be fun.
That is like, I bet there are like 0 role players there. It's like completely out of normal. Because if you go to normal convention, it's a role playing convention or something, or at least something like attached to that. But I bet that people that come there are like 95% don't know anything about role.
So that should be a very interesting experience.
Yeah, that is very interesting. If someone dares to come and play, which I try to encourage as much as possible, because choosing something like Duckburg, because it's so
it's accessible. Yes.
Yeah, accessible. I think it's probably one of the most accessible things in Finland you could do. Donald Duck magazine, what is the really flagship of the Finnish Duckburg thing, has a really long tradition of having really cool language and make-up terms and stuff like that in Finnish language. They used to name things really weirdly, and it's a culture of its own.
Well, great. I think that should be quite an experience, and even if you get, now this is the trouble, I would show you this thing, but it is the thing that is taking the picture. So I can't pick up the webcam and show you the webcam. It would make no sense. But, well, wait, this is kind of funny. Look, I wonder what will happen. Watch this. There, see, it's taking a picture of itself, right? So anyway, but one of those is actually a very suitable camera for a table if you just set up the laptop in the right spot.
Yeah.
It's actually not bad at all. So even if you can't, if you don't have time or the money to get a tripod, then one of those, and in that one plugs into the computer it plugs into the computer all the time. You can either attach it to the computer or it has its own little baby tripod. And so you can position it. So that with that in hand, you could actually do a pretty good job of and the standard camera on the computer for recording its input is excellent. So I think you should do that as sort of your first attempt, at these.
Yeah, let's see. Perhaps like talk about my crew of players who we playtested Entropy with, and to like negotiate them into like recording a session of the game.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great idea. Okay, well, thank you for everything.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, we need to meet. I mean, I need to get over to Finland and have a good time, and